So one was found through the right shoulder, another one was in through the heart.
Within the tranquil fields of Western Ireland, an archaeological excavation uncovered findings far more terrifying than originally anticipated. Beneath the earth lay twisted skeletons, their mouths stuffed with massive stones, their bones destroyed.
As if this person has been broken into many bits and they're bound together into a great bundle of flesh.
As if their own community feared their return. Some remains were burned and bound in strange ways, revealing an event of panic and superstition. These weren't ordinary burials. They were acts of desperation and rituals of protection against something believed to be worse than death itself. What could drive people to such extremes? Were they fighting disease, criminals, or something far more evil, the walking dead? Join us as we uncover what archaeologists found buried underground in Ireland that will leave you terrified. The gruesome discovery. Chris Redd never expected to find what he did that morning at Kilteasheen, Ireland. Leading an archaeological team from IT Sligo, he was hoping to uncover traces of a medieval bishop's palace.
When we started excavating, we were hoping or anticipating that this was possibly the location of this bishop's palace.
He knew that the rolling hills of Western Ireland held secrets, but nothing prepared him for the nightmare buried 3 feet below the surface. When they lifted the ancient flagstones, faces stared back at them. Not faces of the living, but crushed skulls of the long dead, flattened by centuries of weight above them. The building had been constructed directly over human remains, a dark practice that sent chills down the team's spines. "We literally had faces looking back at us," Redd later recalled, his voice still carrying the shock of that moment. Within a small area measuring 3 meters by 3 meters, they excavated between 30 and 40 skeletons, stacked like wood in shallow graves. However, the most terrifying discovery was made as the team expanded their excavation across the raised burial platform. They soon realized that they were standing atop something massive. Based on the density of remains and their distribution, Reed estimated that they had discovered a cemetery containing between 2,500 and 3,000 bodies. This made Kilteasheen one of Ireland's most substantial ancient burial grounds. The skeletons told stories of violence. Many showed cut marks from bladed weapons, evidence of deaths by sword and spear. In medieval Ireland, warfare was endemic, with multiple kingdoms constantly battling for territory and power. Warriors lived and died by the blade, and these bones bore witness to that brutal reality. As Redd approached the edge of the cemetery that fateful morning, he had no idea he was about to uncover evidence of humanity's oldest terror. Among the thousands of battle-scarred remains, 2 skeletons stood apart. They had been treated differently from the rest, buried with a violence that transcended even the harsh realities of medieval warfare. These 2 skeletons would force archaeologists to confront a fear far more ancient and terrifying than simple human conflict. The 2 skeletons waiting in the Irish soil would reveal that our ancestors had faced something they considered worse than death itself. What had these men done to deserve such treatment, and why were the living so afraid of them returning? Stones of terror. The first skeleton emerged from the earth like something from a nightmare. The man lay with his head tilted back, jaw forced unnaturally wide, and wedged deep in his throat was a stone the size of a baseball. The force required to fit the stone into his mouth had been so violent that his jawbone showed signs of dislocation. Chris Reed's team gathered around in stunned silence. In his 25 years of archaeological work, he had never encountered anything like it. The deliberate nature of the act was unmistakable. This had been no accident. No natural occurrence during decomposition. Someone had intentionally done this. The second skeleton lay nearby, positioned differently, but treated with equal brutality. This man's head was turned to the side, and an even larger stone had been wedged into his jaws with such violence that the bone structure was destroyed. Both men appeared to have been physically broken before burial, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the positioning of the bodies. Unlike the other graves in the cemetery, these 2 had been buried outside the perimeter, excluded even in death from the Christian community. They did not lie in the traditional east-west orientation mandated by medieval Christian burial practices. They had been denied the hope of resurrection. Initially, Redd's team theorized that they had discovered Black Death burials. During the medieval plague years, fearful communities sometimes took extreme measures to prevent the spread of disease, including placing objects in corpses' mouths to prevent them from eating their burial shrouds and spreading contagion. However, when the carbon dating results arrived, they revealed something far more shocking. These skeletons, dated between 600 and 800 CE, placed them in the 7th or 8th century. This was almost 1,000 years before the Black Death reached Europe, and centuries before the vampire hysteria that would later sweep across the continent. These weren't plague victims treated with medieval superstition. These were something far older and more disturbing. The people who had buried these men lived in an age when Christianity was still new to Ireland, when ancient fears still held power over the human imagination. But what could have driven an entire community to treat human remains with such calculated brutality? The answer lay buried in the darker corners of human belief, in fears that predate recorded history. And as Graham Hancock has long argued, ancient peoples possessed knowledge and beliefs that modern science is only beginning to understand. The stones in the mouths were more than just rocks. They were weapons in humanity's oldest war against the undead. Walking dead evidence. The dating of the Kilteasheen skeletons shattered everything archaeologists thought they knew about vampire beliefs. For centuries, scholars had assumed that fear of the undead was a relatively modern phenomenon, emerging from Eastern European folklore and spreading west through medieval chronicles and later Gothic literature. But here in Ireland, buried in the soil for over 13 centuries, lay proof that the terror of revenants was far more ancient and widespread than anyone had imagined. The two men at Kilteasheen had been treated as if they might rise from their graves, centuries before the first recorded vampire stories in European manuscripts. Chris Redd analyzed every detail of the burials with growing fascination. The older skeleton, a man who died between the ages of 40 and 60, showed signs of a violent life. His bones bore evidence of healed battle wounds, suggesting he had been a warrior or a criminal who lived by violence. The younger skeleton, a man who died between the ages of 20 and 30, had been powerfully built, his skeleton revealing prominent muscle attachments that spoke of immense physical strength. Both had died violent deaths, but their treatment in death suggested something far more sinister than simple punishment. The community wanted them to stay dead. The rocks forced into their mouths served a specific purpose that echoed through centuries of folklore about the undead. In ancient Irish belief, the mouth was considered the primary portal through which the soul left the body at death, but it could also serve as an entrance, a way for evil spirits to enter a corpse and reanimate it, or for the dead person's own soul to return and inhabit their former body. By blocking this portal with stones, the living were taking no chances. The Irish term for such creatures was Neam Mirb, literally translating to the walking dead. These weren't the romantic, sophisticated vampires of modern fiction, but something far more primal and terrifying. They were corpses that refused to remain in their graves, driven by unfinished business, unsatisfied hunger, or pure malevolence. Archaeological evidence from across Ireland now supports the existence of this ancient belief system. Researchers have found similar deviant burials throughout the country, all dating to the early medieval period when Christianity was still struggling to replace older pagan beliefs. The investigative researcher Graham Hancock has spent decades documenting how ancient civilizations possessed a sophisticated understanding of phenomena that mainstream archaeology has dismissed as superstition. The Kilteasheen discovery validates his approach to taking ancient beliefs seriously as potential historical evidence.
Early medieval burial, you can see the bones are in the ground, the arm bone, the skull and so forth. We've just found it, we're cleaning it up at the moment.
These Irish skeletons represent something profound, physical proof that our ancestors lived in a world where death was not always final, and where the community of the living had to take active measures to protect themselves from those who might return. But why these two men in particular? What had they done to earn such violent treatment, even after their death? Dangerous men's dark secrets. The physical evidence painted a disturbing picture of who these men had been in life. The younger skeleton, despite his youth, showed signs of a life steeped in violence. His bone structure revealed a man of exceptional physical power, with muscle attachment points that suggested he could have easily overpowered most opponents. More telling were the battle wounds etched into his bones. Healed cuts and fractures spoke of encounters with bladed weapons, such as swords, axes, and spears. These weren't accidental injuries or isolated incidents of violence. It is evidence of a lifestyle built around conflict and brutality. Chris Redd's team began piecing together a theory about what might have made these men so dangerous that their community felt compelled to take extraordinary measures to keep them in their graves. In medieval Ireland, certain individuals were considered particularly threatening, not just in life, but potentially catastrophic if they returned from death. Murderers, rapists, and those who had committed acts of extreme violence were prime candidates for becoming revenants. The belief was that individuals who had lived by causing pain and terror would continue to do so after death, but with supernatural powers that made them exponentially more powerful and dangerous. The older man's skeleton told a similar story. His bones showed evidence of a hard, violent life, with injuries consistent with both giving and receiving serious physical trauma. In an age when justice was brutal and immediate, men like these might have been executed for their crimes, but even death couldn't fully neutralize the threat they posed. Ancient Irish law texts from this period describe specific procedures for dealing with dangerous individuals who had died. Those who had committed particular heinous crimes, or who had died under suspicious circumstances, required special burial rites to prevent them from returning to plague the living. The positioning of the bodies outside the cemetery's sacred boundaries was a deliberate exclusion from the Christian community. These men had been denied the protection of consecrated ground, their souls abandoned to whatever dark forces might claim them in the afterlife. Yet paradoxically, the living still feared they might return. Graham Hancock's research into ancient civilizations has consistently revealed that practices we dismiss as primitive superstitions often contained practical knowledge passed down through generations of experience. The elaborate precautions taken with these burials suggest that the Kilteasheen community had encountered the walking dead before. The stones in their mouths were just one element of a complex ritual designed to keep these dangerous men in their graves. Their limbs had been deliberately broken and twisted, their bodies folded around massive boulders in positions that would make movement impossible, even if they did somehow return to consciousness. That being said, these precautions would prove necessary for reasons that go far deeper and darker than medieval superstition. Preventing dark resurrection.
Is no ordinary construction site. Here, they've unearthed some very interesting and peculiar findings.
The deliberate destruction of the bodies went far beyond simple mutilation. When forensic analysis revealed the full extent of the damage, it became clear that whoever had prepared these burials possessed intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the mechanics of movement. Both skeletons showed evidence of systematic bone breaking that would have been performed post-mortem. The spine of the younger man had been twisted completely around, his ribcage compressed, and his pelvis rotated into an impossible position. It was as if someone had intentionally dismantled the body and reassembled it as a grotesque puzzle. The positioning around the large boulders wasn't random placement. It was architectural. Each body had been carefully folded and contorted so that the weight of the stones would prevent any possibility of the corpse assuming a natural position. If these men somehow returned to consciousness, their own burial would become their prison. Professor Mark Horton, who has excavated hundreds of medieval burials across Europe, described the Kilteasheen skeletons as the most extraordinary deviant burials he had ever encountered. The level of deliberate, methodical destruction suggested that the community responsible had developed these techniques through experience and necessity. The broken limbs told their own story. Legs had been snapped and twisted back up around the torso. Arms had been dislocated and wrapped unnaturally around the spine, and joints had been systematically destroyed to prevent normal movement. This went far beyond ritual symbolism. It was practical engineering designed to immobilize the dead. Similar deviant burials have been discovered across Western Europe, suggesting that the fear of revenants was widespread during the early medieval period. In the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found graves where bodies were weighed down with massive stones. In England, skeletons have been discovered with iron nails driven through their hearts, shoulders, and ankles. Each burial represents a community's desperate attempt to solve the same problem, keeping the dangerous in their graves. The consistency of these practices across different cultures and geographical regions suggests that the threat was considered very real by our ancestors. Graham Hancock has long argued that ancient peoples possessed practical knowledge about phenomena that modern science struggles to explain. The elaborate anti-revenant burial techniques found across Europe indicate that multiple civilizations independently developed solutions to what they perceived as a genuine threat. The forensic evidence from Kilteasheen reveals that these weren't hasty, superstitious reactions to death, but carefully planned and executed procedures. Someone with detailed knowledge of human physiology had orchestrated these burials with the specific goal of preventing resurrection. But was their fear justified? The answer lies in understanding what the medieval mind believed about death, the soul, and the terrifying possibility of return. Trapping evil spirits. In the early medieval worldview, death was not a simple transition from life to non-existence. The soul's journey was complex and fraught with dangers, both for the deceased and for those left behind. Understanding this belief system is crucial to comprehending why the Kilteasheen community took such extreme measures with these two men. According to the Irish Christian doctrine of the 7th and 8th centuries, the soul departed the body through the mouth at the moment of death. It then faced judgment and would be assigned to heaven, purgatory, or hell. However, ancient pagan beliefs that predated Christianity lingered in the popular consciousness, creating a hybrid understanding of death that was far more complex and terrifying. The pagan elements introduced the possibility that souls could become trapped between worlds, neither fully dead nor truly alive. Those who had lived violent, evil lives were particularly susceptible to this fate. Their souls might be rejected by the afterlife, and they refused to fully depart from their earthly remains. Even more terrifying was the belief that evil spirits could enter a fresh corpse through the mouth and animate it for their own purposes. These were not the original personalities returning, but malevolent entities using human remains as vehicles for interacting with the physical world. The stones forced into the mouths of the Kilteasheen skeletons served as spiritual barriers, preventing both scenarios. They blocked the original soul from re-entering the body and barred access to any evil spirits that might attempt to inhabit the corpse. This belief system was taken so seriously that it appeared in official church documents of the period. The First Synod of St. Patrick, dating to the 7th or 8th century, specifically addressed the problem of people believing in vampires and revenants. The fact that church leaders felt compelled to condemn these beliefs indicates how widespread and persistent they were. Chris Reed's team discovered that the Irish term nam merb appears in several manuscripts from this period, always in context describing the walking dead as a real and present danger. These weren't abstract theological concepts, but practical concerns that shaped how communities handled death and burial. The positioning of the bodies outside the cemetery's consecrated ground created an additional barrier. Even if the stones failed to prevent resurrection, the lack of sacred protection meant that any returning spirit would immediately be identifiable as evil and could be dealt with accordingly. Graham Hancock's analysis of ancient belief systems consistently reveals that what modern scholars dismiss as superstition often represents a sophisticated understanding of spiritual and psychological phenomena. The Kilteasheen burials demonstrate that medieval Irish communities had developed complex, multi-layered defenses against what they perceived as a genuine supernatural threat. As Hancock noted, looking at these ancient practices, this is not a myth anymore. The physical evidence proves these beliefs shaped real behavior with real consequences. European epidemic of fear. The Kilteasheen discovery was not an isolated incident. As word spread through the archaeological community, similar finds began emerging across Western Europe, revealing a continent-wide phenomenon that had remained hidden for centuries. In Southwell, England, excavations uncovered a medieval burial where iron nails had been deliberately driven through the corpse's right shoulder, heart, and left ankle. The placement was too precise to be accidental. Each nail had been positioned to immobilize the body and prevent it from rising. The heart nail, in particular, echoed later vampire hunting traditions from Eastern Europe. Czech archaeological sites from the 1960s revealed graves where bodies had been weighed down with massive boulders and their limbs bound with ropes. The consistency of these practices across different regions suggested that knowledge of anti-revenant techniques was being shared between communities. France, Germany, and Italy have all yielded similar deviant burials, each showing evidence of deliberate post-mortem mutilation designed to prevent resurrection. The geographical spread is remarkable. From the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the mountains of Central Europe, medieval communities were independently developing similar solutions to the same problem. What makes these discoveries particularly significant is their dating. Many predate the famous vampire panics of the 17th and 18th centuries by nearly 1,000 years. This challenges the academic assumption that vampire beliefs originated in Eastern Europe and spread westward through folklore and literature. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests that fear of the undead was deeply embedded in European consciousness from the early medieval period onward. The later vampire panics in places like Serbia and Hungary weren't the birth of these beliefs, but rather their re-emergence into recorded history. The brutal efficiency of these burial techniques indicates that medieval communities had developed practical experience in dealing with suspected revenants. The procedures weren't based on abstract fear, but on what they believed to be proven methods for preventing the dead from returning. The Church's response to these beliefs provides additional evidence of their prevalence. Multiple synods and church councils from the 7th through 10th centuries specifically condemned belief in revenants and vampires, indicating that these ideas were widespread enough to threaten orthodox Christian doctrine. However, the most disturbing aspect of this European epidemic of fear was yet to be discovered. Modern cases from the 21st century have proven that these ancient beliefs have never truly died. Modern terror returns. The beliefs that drove the Kilteasheen burials never completely disappeared. In 2004, in the Romanian village of Marutino de Sus, 5 men gathered in the local cemetery under the cover of darkness to perform a ritual that would have been familiar to their medieval predecessors. They were hunting a vampire. Petre Toma had died recently, and his relatives claimed he had returned as a moroi, the Romanian term for the undead. His niece reported that her dead uncle was visiting her at night, draining her energy and making her sick. The family was convinced that Toma's spirit had become trapped between worlds and was feeding on the living. The men who gathered that night followed procedures that echoed the Kilteasheen burials with terrifying accuracy. They exhumed Toma's body, cut out his heart, and burned it to ashes. According to witnesses, the heart was filled with fresh blood, despite the man having been dead for months. This modern case demonstrates that the beliefs responsible for the Irish deviant burials survived into the contemporary era virtually unchanged. The same fears that drove medieval communities to break bodies and force stones into mouths continue to influence behavior in remote European villages. Romanian folklore preserves detailed knowledge about identifying and destroying moroi that closely parallels the techniques used at Kilteasheen. The emphasis on preventing souls from re-entering bodies, the importance of blocking spiritual portals, and the need for extreme physical measures all align with the archaeological evidence from Ireland. When news of the Romanian vampire hunt reached international media, the reaction revealed how disconnected modern urban society had become from these ancient beliefs. What seemed like primitive superstition to Western observers was actually the continuation of a sophisticated spiritual practice with roots stretching back over a millennium. Graham Hancock has argued that dismissing traditional knowledge as superstition hinders our understanding of the full complexity of human experience across cultures and time periods. The stones forced into those Irish mouths were not symbols or metaphors. They were practical tools deployed by people who believed they were fighting for their lives against the walking dead. The broken bones, the deliberate positioning, the exclusion from consecrated ground, all were elements of a battle plan developed through generations of experience. Chris Reed's discovery at Kilteasheen opened a window into one of humanity's oldest fears and our most desperate defenses against them. The 2 men buried in that Irish field represent more than archaeological curiosities. They are evidence that the line between life and death has never been as clear as we might hope. The terror that drove an entire community to such extreme measures remains alive in the modern world, waiting in remote villages and ancient burial grounds where ancient knowledge is still remembered and ancient fears still hold power. What do you think drove ancient communities to such extreme measures against the undead? Share your theories in the comments below and subscribe for more terrifying archaeological discoveries. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.